So glad to see everyone here this evening. And welcome everyone to the March 2022 textual study on the Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Taussig. In this study, we'll be talking about spiritual resurrection in the first 2 centuries of Christ people. We'll focus on 2 different sources for the topic of spiritual resurrection. The Treatise of the Resurrection from the Nag Hammadi Library, and 2 of Paul's letters. One, his first letter to the Corinthians, and the other, his letter to the Romans. We'll consider the ways spiritual bodies were underlined and understood. I want to mention before we turn it over to Hal that we encourage and appreciate an ongoing pledge of support from Patreon. We do need your help to keep going. So if you can, please go to patreon.com, Bible and Beyond, to make a monthly pledge that's just right for you. PayPal or checks are also an option if you prefer. Check the chat box here soon or the website for details. And thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And so, Hal, it's all yours. Can't wait to hear what you've got to say tonight.
Thanks so much, Shirley, for leading us in such an important way and the way you set that up for us. Before we get right into the text, I think I would follow up a bit also with where Shirley has begun and for us to note exactly what she said. First of all, notice that this will be primarily focusing on texts from the 1st and 2nd century that think of the resurrection of the spiritual body. So that I would want us to note is actually different than the way most moderns think about the question about the basic dimension of what resurrection is. It looks like, as far as I can see, for most of what one might call modern people of the Western world, there has been a kind of a standoff between various people within the 20th and 21st century, in which basically the question has mostly been, is there a physical resurrection? So notice that I'm framing this about a spiritual resurrection. This is not because I want to be contrary. There are a lot of us still around who are very impassioned about, is there a physical resurrection? And that certainly, there are certain parties all around Christianity and non-Christianity on this. But by and large, for most of the 20th century and into the 21st century, we've had various standoffs about whether there is a physical resurrection. What I would want us to consider as we go into some of the texts of the biblical texts, as well as some of the non-biblical texts, that it looks like much of the question in the 1st and 2nd century was not about physical resurrection, but about spiritual resurrection. And so we will be contrary, I think, to the way we generally hear arguments made. I'm mostly interested in the way the texts stand up for what they call explicitly spiritual resurrection. I'm not going to take really much of a position on what I would call the modern arguments, but would like to have us throw ourselves into some of the texts that are from the 1st and 2nd century. I'm going to do a little bit of reading for you at the beginning, for the first 5 minutes, and for the first, and then after a little bit, and then Shirley's going to for us about midway through. She will read some portions of the treatise on the resurrection, and I'm very grateful for that. What I'd like to do first, however, is go to the New Testament text in Romans, and it's in the 6th chapter of Romans. Those of you who want to whip out the 6th chapter of Romans, that's fine with me. I'm going to be reading just a bit from the 6th chapter, basically about the first 11 verses. And here it's a very passionate, I think wonderfully stunning proposal about how to think about the resurrection. And here, Paul, in this part of Romans, Paul basically wants to start with the questions or the positions around baptism. Now, so that's a little bit weird, right? That the moderns would say, oh, we're going to talk about the resurrection and we're going to start with baptism. It turns out, as you may notice, that baptism also was thought of quite differently in the first 2 centuries. So that Paul begins with what's about baptism. Let me just paraphrase some of it at first. And that is this, that he has very clearly in mind what the people that he is writing to, what they are doing when they would, I guess we would say, kind of baptized, because it's a little bit different than sometimes people think in our day. But in this case, he asks folks to think about the real dimensions of going down into a whole bunch of water. The person who is baptized, and we won't be able to get into that word of baptized too much, but he wants us to think about people singly and more than singly being taken down into a pool of water. Probably in many cases, that of course is a natural pool of water. The 1st and 2nd century doesn't have very much place where there would be a building that people would come together in, and it would also have a pool of water in it. By and large, what you have is people, groups of people going down into a pool of water, and what happens is they go all the way underneath the water. So at that point,
Hal, excuse me, I'm going to just share the screen and show some parallel translations along the way. So what translation are you using?
What translation?
Yeah.
Yes, the translation is from the New Jerusalem Bible.
Okay, great.
It's a Bible that was initially translated from the Greek into French. And then it became so popular in Europe that there was a big translation that then translated from the Greek and the French into the English. Yes, so thank you very much for asking that, Shirley. So here, Paul then jumps in and he says, you cannot have forgotten that all of us, when we were baptized into Christ Jesus, were baptized into his death. Okay, there's it on your screen. Cool. So notice, so in other words, this is basically saying that one way of thinking about going down into that big pool is going into one's death. And now he says, so, and this is verse 4, so by our baptism into his death, we were buried with him, so that as Christ was raised from the dead by the Father's glory, we too should begin living a new life. Notice the comparison here is a little unexpected. So first he's saying that Jesus died like in baptism, and then we too die when we go into this pool of water. And then if we have been joined to Christ by dying a death like his, so we shall be by a resurrection like his, realizing that our former self was crucified with him, so that the self which belonged to sin should be destroyed, and we should be freed from the slavery of sin. Someone who has died, of course, no longer has to answer to sin. So we believe that if we died with Christ, then we shall live with him too. Now here, hold on to this real quickly, because what he is saying is not what we think he's saying. We know that Christ has been raised from the dead and will never die again. Death has no power over him. For by dying, he is dead to sin once and for all, and now the life that he lives is life with God. In the same way, I'm almost done, folks. In the same way, you must see yourselves as being dead to sin, but alive for God in Christ Jesus. So in other words, you've got this thing, okay, Jesus is dying, and then Paul says it's just like when we go into the baptismal waters. And then he says, well, Jesus also raises up, and we too are raised up into new life. In other words, I would want to suggest that probably you thought this was a case for being risen after we die. But this is actually being risen after we go into the pool. And that the rising is a rising into new life in this life. I know that a lot of people read the Bible, but I think people read this first 10, 11 verses of of Romans 6 as if it is about being risen from the dead. This is straightforwardly is being risen after you come out of the water. And one comes out of the water into new life. This is a totally present tense to resurrection here. We're going to look a little bit further with Paul in 1 Corinthians in a few moments to see what he means by that, because I think what we'll see fairly soon is that Paul thinks of the body as spiritual. That's the primary, what exactly that means, we'll be looking at again. But I want to hold on here because I want to say please argue with me or ask questions or see other ways of thinking about this than what I think is right on the page. And that is the real thing to know about resurrection is coming out of the water into new life. So let me pause here and see if I'd love to have some protests or anything else like that, or it may be that this isn't new at all to you all, so that would also be cool as well. So let's hear from you a bit about what do you think about Romans chapter 6, the first 11 verses.
Let me see if I get this straight, Hal, because what I'm hearing you say is that I'm coming out of the waters after baptism. There's almost a fusing of this world with, I don't know exactly what to call it, the divine realm, in the presence of the person or in the presence of me whenever I came up out of those waters. So there's this sort of tying of and I'm sort of thinking of my understanding of Neoplatonism, with where you have the ideal, and then you have these things that have sort of fallen away from it. But it's almost like taking the ideal and tying it to the present situation in the person. Mm-hmm. Am I hearing somewhat correctly there?
I think you may be adding some important things, so I don't want to miss all that you've gotten going there, Anita. But what I am saying is that this is not a future resurrection; it's a present resurrection. But tell me a little bit more about Neoplatonism to make sure that I get all of that.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm an expert on Neoplatonism.
Well,
I read here and there, and so Lord only knows what actually is it fits. But there's sort of a sense of my natural way of coming at this is mathematics.
Okay.
Which is not anybody else's natural way of coming at things. But what I'm really sort of struck with is this idea that somehow there is an identity function that ties two different sets together. I mean, that's the way I would look at it in mathematics, that you have this set that's infinite, you have the set that's finite, but you have this identity function that somehow ties these two things together. And that but it's that tying together that sort of pulls the divine into the present, into what's transitory in the physical space, but infinite in the divine space. I mean, that's the way it makes sense to me in those languages, but I don't think it makes sense to much of anybody else.
Oh no, you certainly, you've got me. And I would want to say yes to that, except that we'll have another turn to make when we get to 1 Corinthians.
Okay.
But what I want to underline is how important two words are for Paul in Romans 6 that you've really brought home to me. One, well, no, I would say the first thing that you talked about is said, this is about identity. And that's so important. So in other words, we don't want to get caught up in what I would call churchiness about what the status of somebody is in church. But that this is, for Paul, this is about a transformation of who we are. I would then stay with the fact that, so this is not about a future identity. This passage is totally caught up in who we are now. So, and then the next thing you did, Anita, is to bring in the word divine. And that will help us in 1 Corinthians too. But here, yes, this is all about thinking of humans as divine. And Paul understands this larger, very difficult way of living in this time in which so many people are dying, especially in Roman violence. And so he's wanting to say God is with one in one's own identity. And so God's, and this is where you said there's a merger there of an identity that is very much present and very divine. divine. These, you can see how this goes against a lot of the modernity, which needs to try to get those apart. So this is a real synthesis of the divine and the human, which again here, from my point of view, it's the kind of secular physicalities that focus that in a way now, and to understand Paul, one really has to sort of stop a completely modernity-based identity, so that words like spiritual and divine can enter the frame. Again, I don't want to bash all of us moderns, because we're moderns and postmoderns anyway. So it's not as if we're pre-modern.
There are just a couple of comments on the chat, Hal. I don't know if you want to stop with them or move on, or tell me about your timing here.
Okay, no, this is good, because I think I myself, at least, I'm on board with Anita, and she's bringing us further.
Yes, and so Janice Johnson is saying this seems to go along with Paul's usual metaphorical style. He calls Jesus' followers to give their lives as a living sacrifice. He often compares sinfulness to death and suffering, and then turning to Christ is described as a new life, the new man. And then Joy says, I think that Paul is helping the new Jesus followers to understand that resurrection is for everyone and can be experienced when we are willing to, quote, die to our sinful nature. And then Susan says, die to our sinful nature, or maybe rather awake to our true divine nature. So those are the comments right at the moment.
Those are amazing. So those last two statements could be in opposition, but I would want to say both of them alongside wouldn't necessarily need to be in opposition to one another. Joy and who talked to
Joy and Janice Hunt Johnson.
Oh yes. So I would want to say both of those at the same time. Yeah, let's see if there's any more thoughts or problems.
Helen
Yes.
is there. Yes, Helen's here.
Yeah, how would you sort of jive with what you're saying with the Paul's First Thessalonian view of the resurrection of everybody? You know, that he's sort of trying to comfort the dead and assuring them that they will be resurrected in the last days. So there is sort of the literalness about that aspect of resurrection that Paul envisions, or whether you see that as, since First Thessalonians is a very early work, whether you see his thought evolving in Romans, or whether it's contextualized in the sense that Paul is speaking to two different communities.
Such great questions and thoughts. I think I'm probably not smart enough for all of that, but I want to say yes to that in general. In other words, Yeah, one of the ways of ducking the First Thessalonians imagination is to say, "Oh, it's just Paul in his younger days," and I frankly think that would that I'm not. I can say that sometimes, but here it seems I would tend to say that the images of going up in the sky, Paul wanting us to say we're going to go up into the sky, or we are going up into the sky. That I would want to say, if we are, we can't here be too modern. In other words, in First Thessalonians and in most of the ancient world, there's a combination of imagination, vision, and reality that we moderns don't allow ourselves. So I would want to say I think there's a decent chance that Paul is still imagining things or spiritualizing things in a way that he does for the rest of his life. But where I'm very worried about my own modernity is to make those opposed to one another. So I would want to say, I think that going into the sky as one dies or when one dies seems to be in Paul in 1st and 2nd Corinthians 2, which is more towards the latter end. I hope you notice that this is again, you've gotten us into a really important part of it, and what I'm saying back is, let's not keep necessarily that the moderns and the ancients have to be thought of as different. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. I think I want to then jump forward. If anyone else needs to jump in right now, let's do that. And then I'm going to go on to 1 Corinthians.
Well, would you be interested in other people's personal experience?
If we can't do that, then we're in the wrong business.
Oh, well, because I know people who have been immersed, and they have said that when they came up, everything changed for them, everything. Mm-hmm. Their whole life and whatever was giving them pain and stuff was completely gone. Mm-hmm. And then I have had what I consider a spiritual baptism, in that I felt an extreme amount of love entering from head to toe, my whole body. And it was very powerful, and I could do nothing except receive it. And I didn't know at the time that was a baptism, because when God talked to me, he said, "Patty, I'm bringing you into my realm." And I thought, oh, goody, I'm going to be resurrected. And what happened was this full body, amazing love that came in. And then when it was finished, I made a joke. I said, I guess I'm too big for you to resurrect or something. And he said, no, one day you'll understand. And I'm at the point now in my study that I do understand that it was a full body baptism, but it wasn't water baptism. It was the Spirit.
And yes, to all of the above. And then I would want to also say, so you mean that maybe those like 7 drops of water that somebody do in baptism might have an option?
I don't know that the people that I've spoken to who did go in the water, they didn't just have 7 drops.
Yeah,
they went in the water.
Yeah, no, I was making fun of the. I was making fun of the modern Protestants who don't try to get almost no water on anybody. And I love throwing people in the water for baptism. But I would want to say that I think Paul would be uncomfortable with making spiritual and physical opposites.
Right. I agree.
Okay. Good. Okay. Well, as usual, we're behind, and I want to do just a bit of 1 Corinthians. So 1 Corinthians 15 is very famous in Christian circles of the last 2 centuries. And it's where Paul is defending resurrection.
Can you talk about verse you'll start with, Hal, so I can bring it up?
Yeah, it's all of 15.
Okay.
And I'm going to be focusing on from 35 on for about 10.
Okay.
Before this part of this chapter, I need to say that there's a part earlier in which Paul says something like this: if there is no resurrection, all is lost.
Right.
What I want you to see is the next part of 1 Corinthians 15, in which we're going to see that what Paul also means by that is if it's not spiritual resurrection, we're all lost. And so I'll read a little bit more here. I'm beginning with 35.
Okay, we'll get there.
Some may ask, how are dead people raised? And what sort of body do they have when they come? How foolish. What you sow must die before it is given new life. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but only a bare grain of wheat, I dare say, or some other kind. It is God who gives it the sort of body that he has chosen for it, that God has chosen for it, excuse me. Don't want to get the he's in there too much. And for each kind of seed, its own kind of body. So he's saying, all right, I'm wanting you to think in other terms about the body. And then I'm going to, because we're a little bit behind, I'm going to go down to, let's say, 41. The sun has its own splendor, the moon another splendor, and the stars yet another splendor. And stars differ from themselves in splendor. It is the same too with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, and what is raised is imperishable. What is sown is contemptible, but what is raised is glorious. What is sown is weak, but what is raised is powerful. What is sown is a natural body, and what is raised is a spiritual body. These are really the Greek words, folks. It's not the funny French monastics who made this translation. It really is. So in other words, I want to just have us note that that here Paul is saying he's not talking about a natural body. He's talking about a spiritual body when he talks about the resurrection. So what I would want to say next here is that like that Romans passage, he is messing up the boundaries between natural and spiritual. And he's saying that the spiritual body, which is a contradiction in modern terms, right? So what he wants to say is that the spiritual body is the real body. I would say, by and large, those of us who are moderns and can't get out of it, we would say that's nonsense. But whatever, this gets us a little further with Paul for us to notice that if one has the modern sense of the natural being everything, one's missing much of Paul's point.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop here because I want Shirley to get on to the next thing fairly soon. But let's see. So putting the Romans together with the First Corinthians, we have many people today say the first part of 1 Corinthians 15 says that if there's no natural resurrection, we're all lost. I just want us to see that the last part of that same chapter says you're missing the point if you go that way.
Now there's a comment here, Hal, in the chat from Janice Johnson again, who says, what about the Jewish idea of bodies resurrecting from the grave as written in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37? So resurrection wouldn't have been a foreign idea to these Jews who were Jesus followers believing in his resurrection.
That's one of my favorite passages. I read that as the people of Israel still in the same place that I hope they stay, and that's with a really infleshed way of living. And I would want to say that I don't think that is about resurrection. I think that's about, I think it's clear. It's there. I mean, we can call it, no, that's not quite right. This is another kind of resurrection, and it's the resurrection of the body of Israel. And so this is in that passage in Ezekiel, what you have is Israel going to rise again? And he says, watch it. And then it literally describes how the whole people who have been completely dead are rising again, and not into an afterlife, but into a real life, into a life that is present so that they can be God's people again. Let's see, whoever said that might want to rebut.
That was Janice Johnson. Do you want to say something, Janice?
So I'm just wondering, I mean, sure, we could look at it that way.
Thank you. Well, and you can look at it another way if you would like.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because okay, where you read, I get what you're saying, but then after that, there is that verse, death has been swallowed up in victory.
Mm-hmm.
When death is your sting. I mean, what is that? It sounds to me like he's talking about somehow that we triumph over death. I mean, but maybe death is, talking again about sin or something.
I wouldn't. I'm not at all wanting to say we're not allowed to talk about when we die. All I'm wanting to say is it looks like, by and large, he's putting equal interest in when we're alive before we die for resurrection as after. So in other words, I really think that there's no reason to be a modern person who doesn't let us think about what happens when we die.
Yeah, but I mean, Paul talks a lot about like how your life can feel like death, because you do all these things that you don't mean to do, and you struggle with sin and all that. So that's like death. And then accepting the teachings that Jesus gave them, that brings you a new life, and doing new good things with your fellow man and all that is the new life. So yeah, that fits. I get that.
Yeah, I get that too, and I like that, and I am that. But I don't want us to shut out what I would call the kind of scientistic moderns who don't let us also think about, well, what happens when we die? And that's a nice, complicated, and interesting question.
Well, so in the Greek, just one more thing. In the Greek, that phrase "spiritual body" is that pneuma then? Pneuma.
That's pneuma.
Yeah. Huh. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's straight up.
Yeah.
Okay. So I apologize for putting Shirley on in the reader spot. But Shirley, would you read us a little bit of the thesis of the resurrection?
Sure. So we'll start with number 8 here. Is that right?
That's okay.
Okay. Right. So the Savior consumed death. You may not be aware of this, for he put aside the temporary world. He transformed himself into an eternal spirit person and raised himself up. He had consumed the seen via the unseen and showed us the path to our immortality. Just as the disciples stated about him, we suffered with him and rose with him, and he went to heaven with him, and we went to heaven with him. Since we are manifested within this world, we wear the worldly covering. Should we radiate from him, we will be embraced by him until our sunset, that is, our death in this life. We are taken to heaven by him, like sunbeams restrained by nothing. Such is the spiritual resurrection, which consumes the mind just as it does the body. Are we going on?
No, I'm good there. That's a great awesome. Final little thing. This is really what Shirley, you say about beyond the Bible. This is really so close to what Paul is saying, but another kind of poetry.
Yeah,
right there. I love the fact, such is the spiritual resurrection, which consumes the mind just as it does the body.
Well, what comes to my thought is these people who had, they were demon possessed, and he cast out the demons, and they had an immediate spiritual, physical, whatever resurrection. I don't know how you would classify it, spiritual or physical, but they changed. They were in their right mind, and they did not return to that way as far as we know. So that was an immediate resurrection. And I think that we can all look forward to that kind of an immediate resurrection. And we do when we turn about and change our way of thinking about who we are. I found it very helpful to see myself simply as an idea held in the mind of God, and that therefore I am protected, surrounded, and that there's nothing can enter his mind, because it is perfect, that can harm me. And therefore I don't have to be obsessed with or concerned about those things that appear. And I feel very protected. I feel very enveloped in this love. And when I think I'm not enveloped in that love, as that idea, he corrects me immediately, and he says, "We are one." And so I think it's a possibility for every single human being to be able to experience that immediate resurrection out of that old way of thinking and acting, and have it change you forever.
Thank you so much, Patty. And let's just notice how close we are to where Anita was a half hour ago.
Right.
This is all about identity. And one can't really think, as far as I'm concerned, about the kinds of identities that the early Christ people have without getting a real wide range of possibilities for what spirit is, what body is, and noticing that Paul really loves mixing those up. And by and large, we moderns have a hard time doing that.
Hal, there's a question in the chat asking where that passage comes from in the Treatise of the Resurrection.
Yes, I was just going to say that we better do our history. So just to say a bit more on this, so this is a part of the Nag Hammadi collection of 52 different texts that were found in 1945, and many of which scholars like Shirley are really pushing ahead so that we can get that in the field of play. And so the thing about that, however, is that for the first 30 or 40 years after 1945, most of the scholars put all of these new texts down and said they were all heretical and that they were all wrong. And that's my type that did that. It took me an extra 30 years before I learned Coptic so that we can get started on this. Now, this text that we're now just getting into, the treatise on the resurrection, has hardly been studied by anyone.
Incredible.
In other words, it's already 75 years old, and the likes of me and Shirley know hardly anything about it. And so that's why we're starting in this regard. But what I want us to know is, first of all, that this belongs to Paul, and Paul belongs to it. And secondly, then when was this written? I want to say so the naysayers on Nag Hammadi generally always put it way later because they don't want it to be in Paul's neck of the woods because Paul's better than them, they think. And so what I would like to say is in this case, I think that probably the treatise on the resurrection is nearer to 200 than I wish it were. But we have to stay straight when we're looking at these new texts and trying to get them in play for us to learn from. When we see something, so the thing that I notice about this, and please read it if you can after tonight too. But if you do, notice that it quotes the Gospels. So, for instance, that is pretty clear that it's later than most of the second century, because most of the second century doesn't do much quoting of this kind. And so it still could be within the second century. Who wrote it? Well, there's this guy who's in the text, but that's just kind of it doesn't have a last name to it or of any kind. So and it doesn't have a family lineage. So I want to say we don't know at all. This is an imaginary name, not an imaginary person, and I would want to say a pretty good theologian and spiritual leader.
And can you tell us what verses you were reading in there so people can go back and find that?
I was, except that my numbers are different than your numbers.
Yeah.
And that, you know why that is? That's because nobody's working on it.
Right.
Or so few people are working on it. So I would want, and here I see Janice is saying, is it in your book? Is it in my book, A New Testament? No. Not because I didn't want it in. I voted for it, but the 20 other people who were voting of spiritual leaders across the country who I asked to decide on it with me, they voted, we only had a chance to have 10 new ones, and this one didn't get it in.
So I like the way you called it a New Testament, because that means we can write another one.
You bet. Yeah, you bet. No, there's and a New Testament they just told me is actually gaining in its sales. So yeah, we'll have to think about that too. Okay, so what here I hope you saw is very much like Paul. That is, it's the spirituality and it's the identity that matters. And it's the unity. I didn't get to show to read this part of it, but there's an explicit part of it saying humanity and divinity are the same. And by the way, the translations in these are somewhat, they need some work. So for instance, we gave for you all in preparation for tonight, we suggested that you read the translation from the Gnostic Society has a really good bunch of translations, and they have some problems as well in it. One of the problems you'll see as you write this material is that the first generations of writing, of translating this, often will not quite know what the Coptic word means, and they will just leave the Greco-Coptic in place. So it sounds like it's a gobbledygook on that. So we're trying to get more real English in those translations as soon as possible.
This is one of
there's the Gnostic Society Library. That's what I was meaning to say. So they really have all of the Nag Hammadi documents. Some of them are better translated than others.
Yeah.
Well, Shirley and I have been trying to decide whether we should have next month's Monday study about some more about spiritual resurrection. So we'd be grateful if you could say yes, no, or maybe in either in the next 3 minutes.
Write it in the chat. You can just say, write it in the chat. Just say yes.
Oh, yes, please.
And then we'll have a whole vote.
Because we've got plenty of other of these new documents to look at. But yes, no, or maybe we would be really grateful for. Now, Shirley, do you have something to say before we leave?
No, you mean in terms of what's next?
No. I mean just what you're thinking.
Well, the only thing I would say, Hal, is that it's just thrilling to me to see the way you're bringing together the biblical and the beyond the Bible things in a way that we can make sense of why things fit together and maybe don't fit together. But I so appreciate that. And these ideas of the spiritual body actually resonate with me. I feel at home with them. And so to me, I mean, I suppose I live in a modern world, but I guess I don't feel modern because these words are too comfortable for me. I like them. And I think there are others on this group who probably feel the same way, kind of the way Patty was talking a little while ago. And I think what you're doing is you're enabling us to say, yes, this feels good. Let's keep going. In fact, we've had about 20 votes and everyone has said yes. So I think you've got the yeses have it, Hal.
Yay. Did I pay some of those people money to vote that way?
I think it'd be fun. Can't wait to see what else you have.
Well, we're grateful for you all being with us and the way you all just jumped in from the very beginning and brought us new vocabularies is really what we need.
This was the March 2022 Bible and Beyond discussion on the subject of the resurrection, the spiritual resurrection, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. We have these meetings once a month, generally the fourth Monday of the month. I just want to also remind you that if you are able to support us with patreon.com, we really appreciate that. You can go to patreon.com, Bible and Beyond. And we'll be happy to see you next week, and we'll be talking about the resurrection with you then. So thanks so much for being with us, everybody. So appreciate it.